Yeah, in our men's work we use the phrase dying before you die. And that's really what most spiritual teachers are talking about. They might use different vocabulary, more on a psychological level than a mortal level. We're not really talking about physical death. We're talking about this death to who you think you are, this death to your self-image, this death to your reputation. Now that can't be engineered. It can't be programmed. You can't set up a situation which will kill the false self. It normally has to be revealed, usually through failure. Usually it has to be taken away from you momentarily, and you have to say, well, who am I now? Without this identity, without this success, without this reputation. So it's more a dying to images, but our images are what we live by, who we think we are, or what we have to live up to. And, I think God, life, grace, take those away anyway as you get older. But what a spiritual teacher does is facilitate that process. Stop protecting it. Die a little earlier, and you can get into the truth more quickly. Again, I hate to be so passive sounding, but yes, you have to consent to it. You have to be aware that you need that. But it's not so much something you do, it is something that's done to you, usually by an experience of love or suffering. That great empathy or compassion for another person's pain. And again, you can't program that, but it happens to you in the death of a beloved or a dear friend or a partner or a child. I don't know any other way to open the heart space but love and suffering. You can't do it by attending a workshop. They can tell you at a workshop, well, you need to open your heart space. And of course, I need to open my heart space. But that doesn't do it. It has to be life and death journeys themselves that open this up. And if you never yourself risk opening it up to love anybody, which we call vulnerability. Vulnerability is, vulnera in Latin means wound. It means the willingness to let another person wound you. And I think that's why most people are called to marriage. They don't know that's what they're doing, but they're giving another person the power to severely hurt them. That's vulnerability. And it's in that context that people grow. It's a paradox, really. Yeah. When I say politics, I really don't mean that everybody has to be involved in the direct political sphere, but that they have to care about the outer world, that it can't just be all interior. The inner journey and the outer journey have to finally work together. But, I think you make a good point that 9 times out of 10, culture wins, not your spirituality. You conform to the way your country thinks, your church thinks, your group thinks, your family thinks. So if you don't have some way to separate yourself from all of those, to who am I apart from my family and my occupation? It's not been pointed out too much, but you would know it from the Gospels. When Jesus calls the first disciples, he tells them to leave their father and their nets, Zebedee and their fishing occupation. This is highly symbolic, because what we've done in most middle-class Christianity is idealize the nuclear family, whereas so often it's highly codependent, closed system. We call them the dysfunctional family, where yes, you love your family, but it can also be a very sick environment where everybody has agreed to be negative, agreed to be fear-based, agreed to be reactionary. And if you don't know who you are apart from your family, you basically stop growing rather early. I mean, it's no accident. The great people like Buddha, Jesus, Francis, they all leave their families at a rather early age and go on spiritual journeys. Whereas we were made to think that, we call it white picket fence Christianity. What it meant to be a Christian was to live behind a white picket fence of security and faithfulness. And it sounds right, but it really isn't, because you stay very small. And of course, in my men's work, I try to make the point that I think that's the role of a father in particular, to lead his family into bigger worlds, beyond the nuclear family, to the extended family, the spiritual family, which is supposed to be the church. But when the spiritual family was not making bigger journeys either, but was a closed system of conformist people who've never made any risky journeys in their life. I don't mean just physical. I mean psychological, spiritual, relational. If you've never left home, never left business as usual, you usually don't have much to teach, you know, because all you do is repeat what everybody thinks they know already. So I hope this doesn't sound disrespectful or rude, but I find the people who have something to say left home and then came back. They never just stayed at home. You know, I'm sure it's not bad will. I'm sure it's we just don't know how. Love has to be modeled for you. You're probably as loving as the most loving person you ever met. If you've never met anybody of real compassion, of risk-taking love, of people who have been willing to suffer for what they love, you really don't know how. It's not your fault. And that's the danger of staying in the domestic church too long. If you're never exposed to what we call larger-than-life people, who are really larger-than-death people, it's the same thing. You define love in a very codependent way. It means hanging on to one another, telling one another not to take risks, and calling that love. Be safe, be safe. And I think it's very common in religion, when even the church on the corner is telling you to be safe. It isn't telling you to see Christ in the immigrant or in the homeless person or in the prisoner. No, we see Christ in other people who are just like us, which isn't to see Christ. Because if they're just like you, it's well-extended narcissism. So I'm trying to say that it isn't bad will. It's just lack of soul expansion. And soul expansion very often happens by risk-taking. You've got to move out of your usual way of relating into some new relationships that force you to, we say in English, outside of your comfort zone. Do you use that expression? Yeah. If you never move outside of your own comfort zone, you'll be my age and you'll still think the same way you did when you were 25. No growth really happens. Sorry to say that, but I think it's true, I think, yeah. Well, I think we can be pretty sure that the church in the future that appeals to humanity will be different than we have now. Because what we have now is largely tribal belonging systems that gathered around historical accidents, really. And I'll start with Roman Catholicism, which was supposedly the mother church of Western Christianity. But we Roman Catholics were never told how aligned we were with the Roman Empire starting in 313, Then we were never told that we split in two in 1054 from the Eastern Church, and we pretended we were the whole church. And then when you good Protestants came along to rightly try to reform us, no one told you that you were at best reforming half of the pie, you understand? And which made you, no offense, a fourth of the pie. And now we've had that group dividing. So the Christ that most of us are dealing with is so small, is so, the frame of reference is so tiny. So once we've come to recognize that, and that's what's happening on the unconscious level, I think, more than the conscious, I would assume that the future church is going to be less belonging systems and more growth and transformational systems. Parallel churches to the Sunday church, which simply keeps affirming the status quo and affirming how wonderful it is to be Lutheran in Latvia, which is a fine place to start, but that's only a start. And if you're still telling people at 50 that the whole meaning of life is to be a wonderful Lutheran in Latvia, and I'm not trying to put down either Lutheranism or Latvia, but that's what I mean in the book Falling Upward by saying that organized religion does the task of the first half of life over and over and over and over again. And it isn't sending people to what I call the second half of life. So in answer, or attempt to answer your good question, I would like to believe that structures are going to emerge to facilitate movement to the second half of life, instead of keeping people baby Christians forever. And I think that's what we're discovering in all of our denominations. I'm not picking on the Lutherans. It's the same in every group, that we just keep waving the flag of our reform or our denomination or our tribe and why we're right. And this is the job of the first half of life, to find your ego structure, to find what's good about being Lutheran, what's good about being Catholic. Then you have to move beyond it, and then you have to come back to it. Isn't that an irony? I don't mean you got to rejoin everything, but you can't spend the second half of life reacting against your first half of life. You have to learn to love it, to forgive it, to see what was good about it, really. So I hope that's an answer, that it's going to be very different. It's not going to be tribal. It's going to be transformational. And what we've had up to now is mostly tribal, almost entirely. All based, as you well say, on the passing on of information, not transformation of persons, not transformation of consciousness or relationships or politics, but just here's the creed of the church, repeat it. So what? Well, again, I'm going to talk in my too common both and way. To begin, I don't think you can begin with an open field of saying, oh, try everything, do everything. You usually have to begin somewhere. You start with the concrete, you move to the universal. And I think one of the illusions of postmodern academic people is I'm going to start with the universal, The rubber never hits the road, in my experience in America. They just float around there forever in a cafeteria of ideas and never commit to anything, never belong to anything, even their marriage. It's a disastrous worldview after a while, and ironically creates very individualistic people and very arrogant people. Ken Wilber makes a great deal of this. He calls this boomeritis, you know, because it's especially characteristic of the boomer generation. They commit to nothing, they belong to nothing, they're faithful to nothing but the latest idea, the latest idea. This isn't it. So I'm again saying that we do best to commit ourselves to some concrete practice, some tradition. The Buddhists call it a lineage. Instead of thinking, I can just create my own lineage. That's just arrogance. You can't. You can't. If it's true, it was true in the 10th century. If it was true in India. It's true everywhere. And you would do well to connect yourself with one lineage. I mean, both the Dalai Lama and Mother Teresa said the same thing. People would come to Mother Teresa and say, should I be Catholic? She said, what are you? I'm Lutheran. Then be a good Lutheran, you know? Go deep in one place. Whereas what's happening in Europe and North America is shallow in about 25 places. Dig one deep well, not a whole bunch of little tiny wells. And I'm just seeing the result of this, of people who have a lot of good ideas. They're very smart. But you wouldn't call them loving and you wouldn't call them faithful. And so they finally don't inspire you. They don't invite the opening of what you rightly call the heart space. The mind space is fairly open, but not the heart space. That's my experience. It's going to sound like an overstatement, but if after a few years of spiritual journeying, I don't see people going outside their comfort zone to people who aren't like them, I don't trust it. I don't trust it. I mean, we have groups in America where it's all upper middle class white people. That's all. Now, I know you're a country of white people, so this is hard. But upper middle class white people mixing with upper middle class white people for 50 years and calling this transformation. That's not going to save the world. There's no future to humanity, because that's just another form of the tribalism that I was criticizing. Now it's a new tribalism that we have created of people who are just like us. So again, I'm talking about, if I don't see you leaving home, you know I'm using the word home. I don't literally mean you have to leave home, but business as usual. If I don't see any journeys outward, I mistrust it. I think it's elitism. I think it's going to lead you to loving yourself, but likely not at a very deep level, but not really loving God or your neighbor. And here I'm totally agreeing with Jesus. The whole law and the prophets are summed up in loving God and loving your neighbor. And loving the neighbor who is not like you is for me the test case, whether the whole thing is real. Bill is a good friend. He lives close to me. He's going to be with us again this fall in New Mexico. I think he's really on to something. He's a little mystic himself. He's a Russian Jew by background. And he told me once he went through his bar mitzvah at 13, and the next day told his parents, I don't want anything more to do with Judaism. He said, I totally reacted against what I call the first half of life. And we've had good talks where he said, now I think I would have the courage to recognize what was good about my Judaism. I didn't need to throw it out so totally. And it's been his journeys into the natural world that have taught him that. It's very paradoxical in many ways. But his soul-centric wheel, it's another model, but in many ways it matches integral theory, Erickson, all of these people who've given us developmental theories of growth. I think his is very good because it's not heady. It's not aimed at academics. Ordinary blue-collar workers, as we call them, go on his vision quests and get it, you know. And the non-elitism of that. Now, I admit it's a little expensive, which makes it elite, but the actual experience is not elite. It's available to anybody. So, yeah, I think he's a bit of a prophet, a very humble man who knows what he knows for sure. And you can feel that solidity in his way of talking. He uses poetry, he uses literature, just beautifully. When I went up to his house in Colorado, just with a group of about 10 people, we spent the whole weekend sitting under a tree, and he'd stand there and talk to us for maybe half an hour, and then he'd send us into the woods and say, come back in an hour. It was a marvelous way of teaching. And he's highly influenced, not just our conferences, but our men's work in particular. Because men, I think, have an inherent mistrust of churchiness. When it's enclosed in a building and led by academics, they just don't believe it anymore. You know, maybe women too, but women have a humility that allow them to trust some of the stuff that men don't have. And so his language is very appealing to the male of the species. Yeah. As you know, my latest tiny book, I didn't bring it this morning, is called Just This. And I'm trying through a set of practices to teach people how to stop this running commentary in their mind and to pay attention to just this, to one thing, and to let one thing be beautiful, to let one thing be fascinating, and to let one thing have voice, have dignity, have worthiness. And it's almost better the more ordinary the thing is, the more simple a thing is. Let's say the loveliness of that round stool, the three legs. Just let it be a bit of an epiphany of beauty. Or who created that? And why were they smart enough to think of two different colors of wood? And you move from the critical mind to the appreciative mind. And what the contemplative does is basically appreciate reality. You learn how to enjoy it. And once you learn that, it takes less and less to make you happy. You don't need Disneyland. I'll use an American example. You know, and that's what's happened. We're being entertained to death in our country. It's just the level of rock shows and entertainments and casinos and theaters and restaurants and hotels. Just, I mean, it rises every year. And now we've got to have that. Now we've got to have that. And yet it seems to me we're a country of angry people because it's never enough. It still isn't the best. Whereas a contemplative can let this make them happy. Once you learn that, you're on a path out of the skies into the incarnation, into the ordinary world. And you can be quite happy for a full hour sitting on the porch of your house. You don't need to fly to wherever. I know that sounds almost too simplistic, but I think it's true. I think it's true. But it amounts to a rewiring of this. What I need, what I think I need to make me content. When one simple thing, just this, can bring you to yes, bring you to contentment, bring you to satisfaction, you're on a path toward spiritual freedom. Because you can't be bought off anymore. You can't be, you won't sell your soul for the system. Right now, almost all of us can be bought off. They just make us a promise of a free vacation to Hawaii and we'll do whatever they say, you know. Or a promotion or a raise in salary. I mean, there's people in my country, I think the whole meaning of their life is to get a raise in salary. I know, what does that mean? This is what existence has come to make more money, and this proves that I'm worthy. That's a dead end, you know? It's going to create very unhappy people at the end of their life. So that's the irony, that true spirituality is really a key to happiness, to satisfaction. Whereas we made it a ticket to the next world, a ticket to heaven. And as I told you, please no offense, in that regard, the Protestant Reformation did not reform Catholicism in the least. It's the same agenda, same thing. And we spent 500 years thinking, well, now we've reformed those stupid Catholics, where you accepted much of the worst of Catholicism, and not the mystical tradition, not the contemplative tradition, not the simplicity tradition of our mystics and saints. But now we're all seeing that together, that we all missed the boat. I'm not trying to pick on any one group, but dualistic consciousness only compares itself to one other, you know. And so you were justified by faith, and we were justified by works. And you repeated that mantra for 500 years. What a waste of time. It's just dualistic thinking. And it isn't true. I mean, I've met Lutherans in my country who are more into achieving their salvation than I am, you know. But they're good Lutherans. And I met Catholics who have profound faith, whereby they totally trust God. So the paradigm that dualistic thinking creates just isn't a true explanation of reality. But we all get invested in dualistic explanations. We choose one side, and we feel this false satisfaction because we chose one side. It's amazing how people can understand this now. And it's just that consciousness was not ready for it. If you're a tribal thinker, then it's choose between two tribes, Catholic or Lutheran. Choose your tribe. Not realizing that both choices were egocentric. We're not really a choice for love or freedom or life or Jesus, really, but for our private salvation project, which kept us narcissistic on both sides. But we're ready for this now. That's the wonderful thing. That we can talk this way. I can talk this way in almost any country. And there's a ready audience. I don't have to talk them into it. They're there already. They just need someone to explain to them what's happening. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you.